I never imagined that a dripping kitchen faucet could turn into the most unexpected and profound shift in my quiet, solitary life. The afternoon light lay soft and golden across the worn linoleum, catching dust motes dancing in the stillness, while the scent of dried lavender from the windowsill mingled with the faint, metallic tang of old pipes. Somewhere in the house, the grandfather clock ticked its steady, lonely rhythm, marking time that felt both endless and fleeting. What happened next remains etched in my memory, a gentle turning point I could never have foreseen. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. It means a great deal to us. I am 72 years old now, and it has been 8 long years since Arthur passed, leaving me to navigate the silence of this house on my own, learning to sleep on one side of the bed and eat at the small table by the window where the morning light first touches the floor. My days have settled into a careful rhythm of small rituals, each one a way to keep the emptiness at bay without pretending it isn't there. A quiet dance between memory and the present moment that structures my waking hours. I wake with the sun, brew a single cup of chamomile tea that steams against the cool morning air, and spend an hour reading in the armchair where his sweater still rests over the back, though the scent of him has long since faded into the fabric. The floorboards in the hallway creak under my slippers, a familiar sound that reminds me how the house settles around me, holding memories in every corner like secrets whispered to the walls, and I find a strange comfort in these auditory reminders of age and endurance. I find solace in the ordinary, in the way the afternoon light stretches across the living room carpet, painting warm rectangles that shift slowly as the hours pass, marking time that belongs only to me and my reflections. But last Tuesday, the steady drip from the kitchen faucet became a persistent leak, pooling water on the counter and threatening the cabinet below with a slow, insistent spread that mocked my attempts to ignore it. I tried to tighten the handle myself, my hands trembling slightly with the effort, but the water only hissed louder, mocking my independence and reminding me of all the tasks Arthur used to handle without a word or a fuss. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spreading dampness, feeling a sudden, sharp wave of helplessness rise in my chest, a reminder that solitude has its practical costs that eventually demand attention. It was a small thing, truly, yet it felt like the world was asking for more than I could give, and my pride finally yielded to necessity as I reached for the phone. With a sigh that felt heavier than it should, I dialed the number for the local handyman service, my finger hovering for a second before I pressed call, opening the door of my routine to a stranger who would soon change the texture of my day. He stood on the porch, with a calmness that seemed to lower the temperature of my anxiety. A man perhaps in his late 60s with silver hair trimmed close and eyes the color of weathered slate that held a quiet intelligence. He carried a worn leather tool bag over one shoulder, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he understood that rushing would only disturb the peace of the afternoon and the sanctity of the home he was entering. His voice was soft when he introduced himself as Elias, a low rumble that carried a warmth I had not heard in a stranger's tone for a very long time, and it immediately put me at ease. I noticed the steadiness of his hands as he set his bag down, the knuckles broad and capable, marked by years of honest work but clean and cared for, suggesting a man who respected his tools and his craft. We exchanged the usual pleasantries about the weather and the difficulty of finding parking on our narrow street, his gaze resting on my face with a respectful attention that made me feel acknowledged rather than inspected, a rare gift in a world that often looks through us. He asked permission to enter, waiting for my nod before stepping across the threshold, and I caught a faint scent of cedar and soap that clung to his flannel shirt, a clean and grounding aroma. As he turned toward the kitchen, I noticed something I did not expect, for he paused to look at the photograph of Arthur on the side table, offering a small, solemn nod of recognition, as if he understood that he was entering a space held by memory as much as by walls. There was a gentleness in his posture that suggested he was accustomed to listening more than speaking, and I felt a surprising ease settle over me as I gestured toward the kitchen, realizing that his presence felt less like an intrusion and more like a respectful visit. He moved with a quiet grace, his boots making no sound on the rug, and when he smiled briefly, the lines around his eyes deepened in a way that spoke of kindness rather than age, revealing a history of empathy etched into his face. It was the unhurried quality of his presence that struck me most, a sense that he had nowhere else he needed to be, and that this moment, however mundane, deserved his full attention and care. Elias knelt by the cabinet, opening the doors to inspect the pipes, and I found myself lingering in the doorway, drawn by the quiet efficiency of his movements and the focused energy he brought to the task. The kitchen, usually so spacious in my solitude, seemed to shrink around us, the air growing denser with the sound of his steady breathing and the faint clink of metal against metal, creating a sensory proximity that felt both new and comforting. I could smell the oil on his tools, a sharp, clean scent that mixed with the lingering lavender, creating a new atmosphere that felt strangely alive and charged with the potential of repair. He worked with a focused silence, his shoulders shifting rhythmically as he loosened a fitting, and I realized I was standing closer than I had planned, watching the way his fingers navigated the cramped space with practiced ease and dexterity. He did not speak, nor did he seem to mind my presence, and I felt a peculiar comfort in simply observing another human being engaged in the act of repair, a reminder that things can be fixed and restored. To settle my hands, I moved to the counter and began to straighten the jars of spices, aligning their labels with a care that felt unnecessary, yet soothing, a small domestic ritual to process the unusual feeling of not being alone. The vibration of a wrench turning echoed softly through the room, a tangible reminder of force being applied with control, and I caught myself listening to the rhythm of his work as if it were a conversation speaking of patience and skill. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the click of the burner igniting a small flare of blue flame, and the routine of preparing tea gave me a reason to stay nearby without feeling intrusive or demanding. As the water began to murmur, I glanced at him again, noticing the way a strand of silver hair had fallen across his forehead, and I had to resist the sudden, absurd impulse to reach out and brush it back, a flicker of intimacy that surprised me. He paused to wipe his hands on a cloth, his gaze lifting briefly to meet mine, and in that fleeting exchange, I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a recognition that I was no longer just a client, but a person sharing a moment of proximity. The room felt charged with a quiet intimacy, not of passion, but of presence, as if the ordinary act of fixing a leak had become a bridge across the silence I had grown accustomed to carrying alone, and I found myself savoring the weight of another soul in my space. Elias stood slowly, wiping his hands on the cloth once more, and the task seemed to reach a natural pause as he tested the faucet, watching the water flow clear and steady without a drop escaping, a small victory in the afternoon. He turned to me with a small smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and remarked that the pipes were old but sturdy, much like the house itself, and that they just needed a little attention to remember their purpose and function. I nodded, feeling a flush of relief, and offered him the tea I had prepared, surprised when he accepted with a quiet thank you, and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, settling in with a natural ease. We sat for a moment in a comfortable silence, the steam curling between us, before he asked how long I had lived here, his voice gentle and curious rather than prying, inviting me to share a piece of my history. I told him about Arthur and the 30 years we had spent within these walls, speaking of the garden and the renovations we had done, and I found my voice growing softer as I mentioned how quiet the evenings had become since he was gone, the silence sometimes feeling like a physical weight. I did not intend to reveal so much, but there was something in Elias's demeanor that invited honesty, a stillness that made me feel safe enough to lower the guard I usually kept raised against the world. He listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, and when I finished, he looked down at the table for a moment before speaking of his own life with a candor that matched mine, bridging the gap between stranger and confidant. He shared that he had returned to this town 2 years ago after his wife passed, leaving behind a busy career in the city to find a slower pace where the memories felt less sharp and the days less crowded. He spoke of the adjustment, of learning to cook for one, and finding that the silence of an empty house could be both a comfort and a weight, depending on the day and the light, and I felt a sudden kinship bloom in my chest. I felt a recognition that we were both navigating the same waters of loss, though our vessels were different, and that his presence here was not just a job, but a search for connection in the small interactions of life. He took a slow sip of tea, his gaze drifting to the window where the light was beginning to fade, and said softly that sometimes a leak is just a sign that something has been under pressure for too long and needs to be released. I paused when I heard his words, feeling them settle deep within me, realizing he was speaking not just of the plumbing, but of the grief we both carried, the hidden tensions that accumulate when we try to hold everything together on our own without support. The double meaning hung in the air between us, unacknowledged yet fully understood, and I looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just a handyman, but a fellow traveler who knew the terrain of solitude and the need for release. He met my gaze then, and there was no pity in his expression, only a quiet empathy that made me feel less alone than I had in years, as if his words had validated the struggles I kept hidden behind my polite smile. We sat there as the afternoon deepened, the conversation drifting to the neighborhood and the changing seasons. But the undercurrent of shared understanding remained, a gentle thread connecting two lives that had intersected by chance, yet felt strangely aligned by circumstance. I found myself wanting to ask more, to hear about his days and his routines, but I held back, savoring the novelty of this connection and the warmth of being truly heard, a feeling I had missed more than I cared to admit. As we spoke, a soft patter began against the window pane, the sound of rain arriving to wash the dust from the streets, and Elias glanced toward the glass with a thoughtful expression that suggested he was measuring the weather against his schedule. He mentioned that the storm might last a while and that he had noticed the seal on the back door looked worn, offering to check it before he left to ensure the draft wouldn't trouble me during the night, a gesture of care that went beyond the original request. I accepted his offer with a gratitude that felt warmer than the tea, relieved to have a reason to extend this unexpected companionship, and he rose to inspect the door while I refilled our mugs from the pot, the routine of hospitality feeling natural and welcome. The rain intensified, drumming a steady rhythm on the roof that wrapped the house in a cocoon of sound, making the kitchen feel even smaller and more intimate, a sanctuary against the weather and the world outside. He adjusted the weather stripping with the same care he had shown the faucet, his movements slow and deliberate, and I found myself sitting at the table, watching him work with a sense of peace I had not felt in a long time, content to simply be in his presence. Time seemed to shift in that room, stretching and compressing in a way that made the minutes feel both endless and fleeting, as if we had stepped outside the usual constraints of the clock and entered a space where only the moment mattered. He did not rush, pausing occasionally to test the latch or to comment on the quality of the wood, and I did not ask him to leave, content to let the afternoon dissolve into early evening without any pressure to conclude our time together. When he finished, he returned to the table, and we sat together looking out at the garden where the rain was nourishing the earth, sharing the warmth of our mugs and the quiet comfort of shared presence, a ritual of stillness that felt deeply restorative. I pointed out the rose bushes Arthur had planted, and Elias listened as I described their colors and their habits, his interest genuine and unhurried, asking questions that showed he was truly engaged with my world and my memories. We spoke of simple things, the best time to prune, the way the light changes in November, and the pleasure of a well-made cup of tea, but beneath the words flowed a current of mutual appreciation for this pause in our solitary routines. He mentioned that he often took his lunch in his truck, eating alone while looking at job sites, and I felt a pang of empathy, imagining him sitting in the cold with only his thoughts for company, a mirror of my own isolation. Without thinking, I asked if he would like a bowl of soup before he went, explaining that I had made a pot of vegetable broth that morning and there was plenty to share, an offer that felt like an extension of the warmth we had built. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his eyes searching mine as if to ensure the offer was sincere, and then he nodded, a soft smile touching his lips as he accepted, his gratitude evident in the relaxation of his shoulders. I moved to the stove, ladling the soup into 2 bowls, and the clatter of spoons and the steam rising from the broth added a new layer of domestic warmth to the scene, filling the kitchen with the scent of nourishment and care. We ate slowly, savoring the flavor and the company, the rain continuing its gentle assault on the windows, and I realized that neither of us was making any move to end the visit, both of us choosing to linger in this bubble of connection. It felt as though we had both silently agreed to remain in each other's presence because it offered something we both needed, a respite from the isolation that defined our days, and the kitchen transformed into a space of shared humanity. I watched the way he held his spoon, the careful way he blew on the hot liquid, and I felt a profound sense of rightness, as if this moment had been waiting for us all along, a second chance at companionship found in the most ordinary of circumstances. The light outside faded to a deep gray, and the lamp on the table cast a golden glow over our faces, highlighting the kindness in his expression and the relaxation in his posture. And I knew that this afternoon would remain a bright memory in the quiet album of my life. As the soup bowls sat empty between us, the conversation drifted deeper, moving past the safe harbors of weather and gardening into the open waters of our inner lives, where the currents of emotion run strong and true. I found myself speaking of the nights when the silence of the house felt heavy, when I would wake and reach across the bed out of habit, only to find the sheets cool and empty, a daily reminder of the absence that shapes my existence. I told him that what I missed most was not the grand gestures of romance, but the small, steady presence of Arthur, the way he would hum while reading the paper, or the sound of his footsteps in the hall, the simple reassurance of another heartbeat nearby that made the world feel safe. I confessed that I sometimes talked to the plants just to hear a voice, even if it was my own, and that the holidays had become difficult milestones I tried to sleep through, avoiding the echoes of celebrations past. The words flowed with a surprising ease, unburdening a weight I had carried alone, and I felt no shame in admitting my vulnerability to this man who had shown me such gentleness and respect. Elias listened with his whole being, his gaze steady and compassionate, and when I finished, he began to share his own story with a candor that mirrored mine, revealing the contours of a life simplified by loss and choice. He spoke of a marriage that had ended not in anger, but in a slow drifting apart, a gradual silence that grew until there was nothing left to say, and how the divorce had left him feeling untethered and unsure of his place in the world. He described his children, grown and busy with their own families, who loved him, but lived lives that rarely had room for his quiet existence, and how he had learned to simplify his needs, reducing his world to the essentials of work and solitude. He admitted that he took these small jobs not just for the income, but for the chance to enter homes and feel the warmth of other lives, to catch glimpses of the domestic intimacy he no longer possessed, a confession that touched me deeply. There was no self-pity in his voice, only a clear-eyed acceptance of his reality, and I recognized in him the same resilience that I tried to cultivate in myself, a quiet strength forged in the fires of loneliness. We sat there, two people who had not spoken honestly in a long time, surprised to find ourselves revealing the depths of our hearts to a stranger who felt increasingly familiar, as if we had known each other in another life. It was a profound moment of recognition, loneliness meeting. Loneliness not with desperation, but with a quiet understanding that we were both still capable of connection, still worthy of being seen and heard. He spoke of the fear that he had become invisible, that his years of work and love had left no mark, and I reached across the table, not touching him, but gesturing with my hand to emphasize that his presence here, his care and attention, mattered deeply to me. I told him that he had fixed more than the faucet, that he had brought a sense of life back into this room, and I saw his eyes soften, a flicker of emotion crossing his face as he absorbed my words. He thanked me, his voice thick with feeling, and said that sometimes we forget our own value until someone else reflects it back to us, a truth that resonated with the ache in my own heart. We talked about the passage of time, how it seems to accelerate as we age, and how important it becomes to cherish the small moments of grace that appear unexpectedly, like this afternoon and the rain and the soup. I shared my hope that I could find a way to embrace the future rather than just enduring it, and he nodded, saying that he was trying to do the same, to remain open to the possibilities that each day might bring. The conversation wound down slowly, leaving us in a state of peaceful exhaustion, as if we had traveled a long distance together and arrived at a place of rest, and a silence fell between us that was filled with the resonance of our shared words. We looked at each other, and in that gaze, there was a mutual acknowledgement of something precious and fragile, a connection that had bloomed in the most ordinary of circumstances, yet felt profoundly significant, and neither of us moved to break the moment. The rain had nearly stopped, leaving only the sound of dripping eaves, and Elias slowly rose from his chair, gathering his tools with the same deliberate care he had shown upon arrival, his movements measured and thoughtful. He stood for a moment, looking at me with an expression of tender regard, and then he reached across the table, his hand extending toward mine with a slowness that gave me every chance to withdraw, a gesture of respect and invitation. I did not pull away. Instead, I lifted my hand to meet his, and his fingers closed around mine with a warmth that felt solid and grounding, a gentle pressure that conveyed more than words ever could, bridging the space between us. He held my hand for a long moment, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles, a gesture of acknowledgement that recognized my humanity and my worth, and I felt a wave of emotion rise in my throat, sweet and aching. There was no passion in the touch, only a profound sense of connection, a silent communication that we were both here, both real and both deserving of kindness, a moment of pure presence that stripped away all pretense. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and saw the same depth of feeling reflected in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made my heart beat with a steady, hopeful rhythm, confirming that this connection was mutual and sincere. He did not speak, nor did he need to, for the gesture said everything, bridging the gap between us with a simplicity that felt utterly right, and I allowed myself to lean into the moment, to accept this gift of touch without questioning it. I did not explain myself to myself. I did not retreat into the safety of my routines or my grief. I simply allowed the moment to be, accepting the connection with an open heart, feeling the warmth of his hand seep into mine. The sensation was one of homecoming, a feeling of returning to a place I had forgotten existed, where intimacy was not about romance, but about being witnessed and held in regard, and I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. He squeezed my hand gently before releasing it, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second, and I felt a warmth spread through my arm, settling in my chest like a glowing ember that would keep burning long after he was gone. It was a moment of pure presence, stripped of all expectation, where two souls touched and recognized each other in the dim light of the kitchen, and I stood there, my hand still tingling with the memory of his touch. I realized that for the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not as a widow or an elderly woman, but as a person with a heart that still beat with hope and desire for connection, and this realization washed over me with a quiet joy. Elias smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes. And I knew that he felt it too. This shift in the atmosphere, this acknowledgement of something precious that had passed between us, changing the landscape of my solitary life. Elias shouldered his tool bag and walked to the door, pausing on the threshold to turn back and suggest that he could return in the spring to help me prepare the garden, mentioning that the roses would benefit from fresh mulch and careful pruning. I accepted his offer with a smile, feeling a spark of anticipation for the future, a sense that the seasons ahead held more than just the passage of time, and we agreed on a day, a small plan that anchored this encounter in the reality of days to come. He promised to call before he arrived, his voice warm with the assurance of a promise kept, and I watched him walk down the path, his figure silhouetted against the gray light of early evening until he drove away and the taillights faded. The house settled back into silence, but it was a different silence now, one that felt less empty and more like a pause, filled with the echo of our conversation and the memory of his touch, a silence that held the promise of return. I turned back to the kitchen and looked at the faucet, now dry and still, the leak repaired with a skill that spoke of care and attention, and I understood that something else in the house, and in me, had also been repaired. A crack in my spirit had been sealed by the warmth of human connection, and the gentle acknowledgement of my worth, and the ordinary afternoon had become a turning point, a reminder that life does not end with loss, but continues to offer opportunities for companionship. I touched the counter where we had sat, feeling a profound gratitude for the unexpected gift of this day, and I knew that I would carry this feeling with me, a quiet light to guide me through the nights. It is never too late to feel seen, to open the door to the unexpected, and to find that even in the quietest corners of life, connection can bloom when we least expect it, bringing warmth to the coldest days. Some repairs go deeper than the wall they fix, mending the invisible fractures of the heart and reminding us that we are still part of the living world, worthy of love and attention and capable of finding joy in the present. Life does not stop surprising you. It only changes the way it knocks on your door, and sometimes all it takes is a dripping faucet and a gentle stranger to remind you that you are not alone.